Well, welcome to another wonderful day in the Word of God. As we continue our study of the letter of James together, I want to challenge you once again to continue striving toward maturity in your spiritual life and in your faith. Today we're going to be moving into the third chapter of James. Now, as we do so, we find James placing some challenges before us which are very difficult for many of us to live up to. The series we are currently making our way through has been entitled Maturing in the Faith, and today we're going to focus on the topic of how self-control in speech reveals a maturing faith. Let's begin by taking a look at our text passage we find in James chapter 1 James chapter 3 verses 1 through 6. This is what James writes beginning verse 1. Not many should become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a mature man who is also able to control his whole body. Now, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we also guide the whole animal. And consider ships. Though very large and driven by fierce winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So too, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how large a forest a small fire ignites. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness, is placed among the parts of our bodies. It pollutes the whole body, sets the course of life on fire, and is set on fire by hell. As we open chapter 3, I want you to be reminded that James is addressing the overall issue of a maturing faith. It's easy to look at the letter of James and think that it is just some kind of ensemble of varying topics which really have little to do with the previous topic or even the one to follow. But I want to assure you, we must be assured that James has a strong structuring when we consider his major topic or the connecting thread throughout this concept of maturing in the faith. Now, as we made our way through the first two chapters, we found James capitalizing on the idea that a maturing faith would express itself in good deeds. One such as helping fellow believers who are in need. Another example of faith in action, which is the one we're going to arrive at today, concerns self-control with words, which is a very common topic among the wisdom literature. Now, James circles back to a topic that he had already raised back in chapter 1, verse 19, where he declared, everyone must be quick to hear, now listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. James makes it clear that controlling our speech is such an important and challenging example of faith that he writes that those who can control their tongues are mature or perfect there in verses 1 and 2 of James chapter 3. In other words, self-control with words is a valuable measuring stick for spiritual maturity. Now, James utilizes three pictures as examples here of the tongue's magnificent, mighty power. In the first picture, mentioned in verse 3, he likens it to a bit in a horse's mouth. And though that bit is small and really appears quite insignificant when you look to it in relationship to the size of the animal, it still contains the power to have complete and total control over that animal. In his second picture, James mentions there in verse 4, he likens the tongue to the rudder of a ship. He says, though that rudder is extremely small in comparison to the great vessel that it is attached to, it still contains the power to steer and direct that vessel according to how the one in charge wants to direct it. Think about that. The third picture James uses that he addresses in verse 5 is the concept that a very tiny spark can create a massive fire. Although that spark appears small and insignificant, it affects a large area. Folks, the tongue, it's really such a small thing in relationship to our bodies, and yet it can boast great things. And it can create very, very large problems. And James in verse 6 makes it quite explicit how the tongue's negative implications are made. Notice what he declares in verse 6. He says, the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness, is placed among the parts of our bodies. It pollutes the whole body. It sets the course of life on fire and is set on fire by hell. Wow. Folks, that is something we all need to stop for a moment and think about. Think about your own use of your tongue. Do you use it to build up or to tear down? Folks, let me tell you what I've seen. I have seen people destroy entire congregations of people by use of their tongue. Giving the pastor a tongue lashing, giving the deacons a tongue lashing, saying things about other brothers and sisters in the Lord in their own community of faith that just simply should not be said. Tearing people up. It's apparent that God is extremely displeased with our inability to bring that tongue under control. Our culture, it's filled with words that wound and distract and destroy. Our own speech, whether it's spoken in conversation or we post it online, remember, is never just words. These words carry strong implications. I want to challenge you today. Think about this. I want to challenge you to think carefully and to use words that demonstrate faith and that reveal love. Prayerfully resolve to let your spoken and written words bring nourishment and healing to others. Until next time.